the cradle of quarterbacks. Purdue University has earned this nickname through the amount of quarterbacks they've sent to the NFL. With names such as Len Dawson, Bob Greasy, Jim Everett, and Drew Brees, it's easy to see why they've earned this name. But when looking at this quarterback list, one name stands out. The only one that made it to the league undrafted and unrecognized. The name? Gary Danielson.
United States, he gives to Amici and the ball game is over. Alan Amici has scored the touchdown and the Baltimore Colts are the professional football champions of the world. His pass is broken up by Tatum. It's off.
Goes to the back of the end zone, and it is caught for a touchdown by Holmes. Unbelievable. Incredible. Second and goal. Pass. Got it.
Danielson's time at Purdue was interesting. Having just 2,748 yards in 3 seasons and more interceptions than touchdowns, one would assume that he didn't play too much. While it is true that he split time with teammate Chuck Peebs his freshman season, he became the starter by year 2, and played almost his entire junior year with no rotation at the position. Despite this, he racked up just 735 yards the whole year. Why such low production? Well, they were a heavy run-based team. In 1972 alone, they ran the ball an outstanding 655 times. Compare this to their measly 138 passing attempts Danielson had, and you can see why his numbers don't look that impressive. NFL scouts also weren't that impressed. With the team having a losing record under Danielson, and him being outperformed by the team's running back Otis Armstrong, Danielson went undrafted in 1973. Being determined to play football at a professional level, Danielson turned to an upstart league to keep his football dream alive. In 1974, Gary Danielson signed with the, at the time, New York Stars, which was a member of the World Football League. This league was a disaster, as evident by the Stars themselves. In the middle of the season, the Stars packed their bags and shipped them across the country to North Carolina, becoming the Charlotte Hornets in the middle of the year. Without getting much playing time and the absolute chaos surrounding that organization, Danielson did not re-sign with the team the following year. However, he did stay in the World Football League, and in 1975 signed with the Chicago Winds. This would prove to be a mistake. Not only did the Winds end up folding after just 5 games into the year, the league itself wouldn't last too much longer. In October that year, the league announced that due to waning national interest and a loss in TV revenue, they would cease operations of the league immediately. With the closure of the World Football League, Danielson thought his playing career was over. That was until 1976, when an NFL team came calling asking for him to be their backup. Who was the team? The Detroit Lions. Danielson wouldn't step on the field that year. They already had a starter in Detroit, that being Greg Landry. Their second-string quarterback was a 28-year-old Joe Reed, who had been with the team for 3 years. Reed was an ineffective starter in 1975, replacing the injured Greg Landry. This forced the Lions to go out and sign a new backup quarterback in case Landry missed multiple games yet again. Landry would play in every game in 1976, however, and started in all but 2 of them. The Lions finished with a 6-8 record, and they missed the playoffs. Fast forward to October 23rd, 1977. The Lions traveled to Candlestick Park to play the 49ers, who were entering the game 0-5. Led by 30-year-old Jim Plunkett, yes, he was a 49er, San Francisco put up 28 points on the Lions. And with Landry being knocked out of the game and Reed being ineffective as usual, head coach Tommy Hudspeth finally gave Danielson a chance. He went 3 of 8 and threw a pick. So back to the bench he went. That was until Week 10, where the Lions faced off against the 0-9 Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Bucs held the lead until the 4th quarter, being up 7-3. Starting quarterback Joe Reed for Detroit was benched after throwing 2 interceptions. Gary Danielson stepped in. And while his 7 for 17 for 80 yards doesn't look that impressive, he led the Lions on a comeback. The Lions would go on to win that game 16-7. So fast forward to week 13. The Lions just dropped 2 games in a row and fell to 5-7 on the year. Trying to keep the season afloat, Greg Landry was benched in favor of Gary Danielson. Despite him not throwing a touchdown, the Lions did win 13-10. That win earned him the starting position for the final game of the year, versus the Vikings. Gary would go 11 for 30 and throw 2 picks in a 30-21 loss. On the bright side, he did toss his first NFL touchdown, and throw for a personal best in yards up until that point, with 153. After missing out on the playoffs consecutive seasons, there was turmoil in Detroit as to who the starting quarterback for 1978 should be. The Lions had fired their head coach in the offseason, and new head coach Monte Clark was less than convinced that Gary was their answer. Greg Landry started the first 4 games of 1978. The Lions went 1-3 in that stretch, their only win coming in Week 2 versus the Buccaneers. Headed into the game versus the 5-0 Washington Redskins, the Lions needed a new edge. Gary Danielson would enter the lineup, and he wouldn't leave. Danielson would finish the year with 2,294 yards, 18 touchdowns, and 17 interceptions. He started 11 games that year. And while the numbers don't look that impressive, his record was. The Lions were 6-5 when Gary started. With Greg, they were just 1-4. Headed into 1979, the Lions finally had high hopes of returning to the postseason. Instead, they went 2-14 and had their worst record since 1948. What the hell happened? Well, that's because Gary Danielson suffered a season-ending injury in the preseason, which forced the Lions to start 9th-round rookie quarterback Jeff Comlow. Predictably, that didn't go well. In 1980, Gary was back, and better than ever. He threw for over 3,000 yards and had a positive touchdown-to-interception ratio. I know that doesn't sound too impressive, but for the time, it was good enough for 7th best season for a quarterback that year. Much more importantly, however, the Lions were finally back in the win column. Detroit started 5-1 that year, including a truly inspiring and heartbreaking game versus the Packers in Week 2. For context, Gary's wife had given birth to their new daughter around the same time the Lions season kicked off. Sadly, his daughter would pass away just 9 days later. No one expected Gary to be out in the field in Week 2 versus Green Bay, as the tragedy occurred just 72 hours before the game. Danielson would play anyway, though, citing he didn't want to let his teammates down. Not only did he play, but he balled out. He threw for 246 yards and a touchdown in that game, and the Lions won 29-7. And despite the 9-7 finish, the Lions missed the playoffs yet again. They finished second in their division behind the Vikings, who also finished 9-7. The following year, the Lions started 2-2. Unfortunately, Gary Danielson dislocated his wrist during a Week 4 game versus the Raiders. Though they would win that game, Danielson wouldn't return for the rest of the year. That forced Detroit to start 24-year-old Eric Hipple, who was drafted by the team in the 4th round of the 1980 NFL Draft. The Lions finished 8-8 that year, and missed the playoffs yet again. Heading into 1982, the position of starting quarterback was up in the air yet again. Both Danielson and Hipple had finished 81 with a quarterback rating of 73.4. Head coach Monte Clark couldn't decide who to start, so they rotated. Gary started 5 games in the strike-shortened season. Eric started in 4. The team would go 4-5, but because of the strike, the NFL expanded their playoffs to 16 teams, allowing Detroit to experience the playoffs for the first time since 1970. Eric Hipple started in that playoff game versus the Redskins. He went 22 of 38 for 298 yards with a touchdown, but 2 interceptions. Despite the relatively solid performance, the Lions got trounced in that game, 31-7. Though to be fair, Washington went on to win the Super Bowl, so you can't be too mad. Despite the fluky nature of their playoff appearance in 1982, the Lions didn't go away. In 83, they went 9-7 and finished first place in the NFC Central, the first time that had happened since 1957, which was also their last championship win. And while Hipple started in all 16 regular season games that year, Danielson still appeared in 10 of those, and by the end of the year, he had 7 touchdowns to only 4 picks, which led him to having a higher rating than Hipple did. In fact, the Lions might not have even made the playoffs if it wasn't for Danielson. In Week 16, the Lions were losing a divisional round game versus the 2-13 Buccaneers. Needing a win, the Lions benched Hipple in the second half in favor of Gary Danielson. He brought the team storming back, and finished the game with 143 yards and a touchdown. Because of his valiant effort, Danielson was named the starter for the wildcard game versus the 10-6 San Francisco 49ers. While Danielson himself struggled that day, he did enough to guide the Lions down the field for a chance at a game-winning field goal as time expired. All the Lions' playoff hopes rested on the foot of All-Pro kicker Eddie Murray.
There it is right now. This is pressure. Long enough. It is no good. He missed it to the right.
Danielson had returned to the starting role by 1984, but the team wasn't quite the same. They started slow, and heading into a Week 8 game versus the Vikings, the team was 2-5. Just as they seemed to be finding their footing, another tragedy struck the team.
I was complaining because my shoes was getting caught in the seams when I run or take off or whatever.
Here comes Billy on a sweep right behind Greco. Uh-oh.
Yeah.
Billy Sims holding his right knee.
But I'm thinking it's just a bad sprain. I'll be okay.
The damage was extensive. Sims had torn multiple ligaments.
Their all-star running back would never play another game. After that, any hope they had was deflated. They only won one more game that year. And in the offseason, the Lions cut ties with the now 33-year-old quarterback. So, Danielson signed with the Browns in 1985. Despite going 4-2 as a starter that year, a shoulder injury he suffered in Week 5 prevented him from remaining the starter for the whole year. The Browns would finish 8-8, which somehow was good enough for first place in the AFC Central that year. Their playoff game was against the Dolphins, a game Bernie Kosar, the team's rookie quarterback, would start. They lost. Because of Kosar's struggles in his rookie season, the Browns kept insisting that Danielson was still their starter. In the 1986 preseason, Gary suffered yet another injury. This time a broken ankle. He would miss the entire year. And unlike his rookie season, Bernie took advantage of his break. He led the team to a 12-4 record, and took them all the way to the AFC Championship game, where they ran into the Denver Broncos. And history was made.
He'll run. Touchdown, Mark Jackson.
After that spectacular run, Kosar never gave the starting role up. Danielson would stay in the league until 1988, but he remained the team's backup. So, looking at his career stats as a whole, it's hard to see why Gary was a starter for as long as he was. But stats don't tell the whole story here. He was a very solid quarterback for the Lions for much of the 70s and 80s, and was an excellent mentor to what is still Cleveland's best quarterback in their history. So, while he may not be the most fondly remembered player in his day, and as time goes on he will get more and more forgotten by the NFL fans, he is still worth a lot to the fan bases of the teams that he played for. And that's why I wanted to look at and highlight his football journey.